On August 15th, America did not see strength. It saw weakness. And that weakness had three faces: Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and Steve Witkoff. These men sat at the table with Russia, entrusted with defending the interests of the United States. And what did they give us? Hesitation, platitudes, and a performance so empty that our adversaries could hardly believe their luck. I will not soften my words. They failed. Trump, the man who boasts endlessly about toughness, delivered phrases so cautious they bordered on surrender. He spoke of dialogue, as if dialogue alone could defend our allies or deter aggression. He muttered about cooperation, as if repeating the word could substitute for resolve. What the world witnessed was not leadership, but retreat. And standing next to him was Marco Rubio. His task was to prove that America's top diplomat could command respect, could show our adversaries that the United States does not blink. But instead, he recited sterile lines about stability and long-term partnerships. He looked less like a Secretary of State and more like a spokesman rehearsing talking points, too afraid to face the hard truths of the moment. And then, as if this spectacle were not bad enough, Steve Witkoff sat there, a businessman at a diplomatic table. He spoke like an investor chasing profits, not like a guardian of national security. He thought in terms of deals and openings, while Russia tested our resolve. He treated the stakes as if they were contracts to be signed, not borders to be defended. This is what America was given on August 15th. A president who hesitated, a secretary who wavered, and an envoy who misunderstood the gravity of the moment. I will call it exactly what it was: a national humiliation. America did not project strength. It projected surrender, and the consequences will echo long after the cameras stop. Day after day, I hear the excuses poured out of the White House, excuses meant to disguise what the whole world saw on August 15th. They tell us that Donald Trump showed restraint, that his vague words were part of some grand strategy. Let me tell you plainly, there was no strategy. What we saw was a president terrified of confrontation, a man who calls himself strong but crumbles when challenged by Moscow. He repeated lines about cooperation, about dialogue, about avoiding escalation. But what he avoided, most of all, was responsibility. A commander-in-chief who cannot say no to an adversary is not a leader. He is a liability. America needed a firm hand, and instead it got hesitation that reverberated across the globe. And next to him stood Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, with a chance to show that his office means something more than titles and sound bites. He had the microphone, the cameras, the world's attention. And what did he deliver? Hollow talk about stability, phrases that sounded rehearsed, words that carried no weight. Our allies did not hear reassurance. They heard avoidance. Silence in the face of threats is not diplomacy, it is surrender, dressed up as patience. And then there was Steve Witkoff. A billionaire developer with no diplomatic training sat at that table, speaking in the language of deals and opportunities. His presence was an insult to every American who believes foreign policy should be guided by expertise, not by personal connections. He thought in profits, not principles. While Russia tested America's resolve, he pitched visions of partnership as though geopolitics were a real estate transaction. The nation deserves better. Our people deserve defenders, not investors. I will continue to say this until it cannot be ignored. These three men betrayed the gravity of their roles. They diminished our credibility abroad and embarrassed us at home. Across the nation, citizens watched those negotiations with disbelief, and the questions have not stopped since. Why did Donald Trump, who boasts of his strength, hesitate when faced with Russian demands? Why did Marco Rubio, given the full authority of his office, fail to deliver anything resembling firmness? And why was Steve Witkoff, a businessman with no experience in geopolitics, allowed to sit at the table where America's security was being discussed? These questions are not rhetorical. They cut to the core of how power is exercised in Washington. When leaders falter, the consequences are not abstract. They ripple into the daily lives of Americans, shaping our safety, our alliances, and our reputation abroad. Families in Europe, who rely on U.S. defense systems for protection, now wonder whether American promises mean anything at all. Soldiers deployed overseas wonder whether the commanders at home still have the will to back them if tensions rise. And ordinary citizens here in our towns and cities see a government too timid to confront those who threaten our values. Trump's defenders insist he is playing a long game. But long games cannot explain silence in a moment that demanded clarity. Rubio's supporters argue that his diplomatic language was meant to calm tensions, but calming an aggressor is not diplomacy. It is appeasement. As for Witkoff, the argument collapses on its face. No citizen elected him, no one entrusted him with authority, yet there he was, shaping the narrative of America's response. This is the tragedy. Instead of unity, resolve, and leadership, we witnessed hesitation, vanity, and opportunism. That is why the outrage is not dying down. Because people know deep down that what happened on August 15th was not strength at all. It was weakness dressed in polite words. And weakness, history teaches us, invites aggression. Inside the corridors of Washington, the aftermath of August 15th has become more than a debate. It has become a reckoning. Analysts point out that in the world of diplomacy, perception often outweighs reality, and the perception here is damning. What allies saw was a trio of American representatives who spoke softly, avoided confrontation, and left critical questions unanswered. Donald Trump's vague assurances, Marco Rubio's polished but empty rhetoric, and Steve Witkoff's out-of-place interventions created the impression of a team unprepared for the gravity of the moment. For Jasmine Crockett, this failure was not just a lapse of judgment. It was an insult to every citizen who expects strength in the face of foreign pressure. She framed it as a betrayal, and in many ways, the evidence supports her claim. By failing to project confidence, the delegation gave Moscow the upper hand, not in signed agreements, but in the battle of narratives. Russia walked away with the image of a superpower willing to blink, while America was left to explain why its leaders could not summon the courage to deliver firm words. The consequences of that image are already spreading. European partners question the reliability of Washington's commitments. Asian allies wonder whether similar hesitation would appear if their security were challenged. And at home, Americans see leaders more interested in managing optics than in defending values. This is where Jasmine's critique gains weight. Her insistence that August 15th revealed weakness resonates not because of partisanship, but because people recognize the truth in her words. They saw hesitation broadcast live. They heard the softened tones where strength was promised. And they know that adversaries watch those same broadcasts with interest. What was lost that day was not just diplomatic leverage. It was trust, both abroad and at home. In the hours that followed, the fault lines within Washington grew sharper. Lawmakers convened in small clusters, debating not only what had happened in the negotiation room, but what it meant for the country's global standing. Jasmine Crockett's words continued to echo across television screens. America had blinked, and the world had noticed. This was not simply her political opinion. It was a sentiment increasingly shared by citizens who had watched the press conference live. They had expected clarity, but instead they saw hesitation, and it shook their confidence in those who claimed to defend them. Donald Trump's defensive tone, Marco Rubio's carefully measured but ultimately hollow justifications, and Steve Witkoff's awkward attempts to insert himself into the dialogue painted a picture of leadership that was fractured and unconvincing. For Jasmine, the symbolism was undeniable. Three men tasked with projecting American strength instead revealed its fragility. That is why her critique has gained momentum. It is not simply about what was said or unsaid in Moscow. It is about the perception that the United States lacks unity at the top. Foreign capitals have already begun recalculating, asking whether Washington is prepared to confront challenges head-on or whether its leaders will retreat into cautious language. Within think tanks and editorial pages, the verdict is increasingly harsh. Analysts warn that credibility, once lost, is not easily regained. Allies who once looked to America for certainty now wonder if they must prepare to stand on their own. And adversaries, emboldened by hesitation, test the boundaries with new confidence. The weight of this moment is not abstract. It is tangible, shaping policy decisions across the globe. And every misstep by those three men on August 15th becomes part of a narrative Jasmine insists the nation cannot afford to ignore. The following day, Washington awoke to a political climate thick with tension. Cable networks replayed Jasmine Crockett's sharp remarks on a near-constant loop, and commentators from both liberal and conservative outlets admitted that, whether one agreed with her or not, she had managed to frame the debate in stark and unforgettable terms. Her voice had crystallized what millions were already whispering, that the August 15th delegation had failed its most basic test. The trio of Trump, Rubio, and Witkoff now found themselves on the defensive. Donald Trump lashed out on social media, insisting he had shown strategic patience rather than weakness. Marco Rubio published a carefully written op-ed claiming that diplomacy was a long game and that critics were short-sighted. Steve Witkoff, less experienced in the political spotlight, stumbled in a late-night interview when asked to justify his presence in the talks, muttering about business insight before abruptly ending the segment. None of these responses carried the weight needed to counter Jasmine's attack. In fact, each statement only seemed to highlight how fractured and unprepared the American side had looked on the world stage. Meanwhile, citizens across the country were no longer content with speculation. Town halls, editorial pages, and digital forums buzzed with a singular demand: transparency. What exactly had been promised or conceded behind those closed doors? Jasmine capitalized on this demand by announcing a call for full disclosure of the negotiation records. Standing before reporters, she declared, "Leadership without honesty is not leadership at all." The soundbite ricocheted through social media, transforming overnight into another trending hashtag, #ShowUsEverything. For Jasmine, the momentum was palpable. She was no longer merely critiquing. She was setting the agenda, forcing those three men into a corner where silence and vagueness would only deepen the crisis. As evening descended over Washington, the political storm that had been building for days reached its most dramatic crescendo. Jasmine Crockett, no longer just an outspoken critic, but now the face of an expanding movement, stood beneath the bright lights of the Capitol steps to deliver what many described as her most defining address yet. With thousands gathered on the lawn and millions more watching through live broadcasts, she began with a simple, piercing declaration. August 15th was not a negotiation. It was a capitulation. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing across the city. She went on to frame the trio of Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and Steve Witkoff not as public servants, but as men who had collectively failed the nation when the moment demanded fortitude. In Jasmine's telling, they had chosen caution over clarity, secrecy over strength, and left America appearing weaker on the world stage. The narrative resonated with her listeners, who had grown restless with the evasive answers and defensive postures of those accused. As Jasmine spoke, large screens displayed headlines that had dominated the week. "He blinked," "Failed talks," and "Where is the courage?" Each clip reinforced her message that leadership had gone missing at the highest level. She underscored that this was not about party politics, but about trust, courage, and the integrity of national security itself. "When leaders falter," she declared, "it is the people who must rise." Her words carried a tone that was both condemning and galvanizing, a reminder that political accountability is never abstract. It belongs to every citizen. By the time she finished, chants of "Show us the truth" thundered through the night air, signaling a public mood that could not be pacified by platitudes or spin. For Jasmine Crockett, the path forward was unmistakable. She had positioned herself as the standard-bearer for courage in a time when, by her account, others had chosen to blink.